Last section, we explored epistemological questions, fundamental questions about knowledge itself. What is its nature? Is knowledge possible? How can we acquire it? But now it's time to do what we might call applied epistemology, to put what we've learned to work and figure out whether certain methods of generating beliefs can generate knowledge, and whether certain beliefs count as knowledge. Those most interested in these questions are often philosophers of religion. One of their main concerns is whether or not religious beliefs can be justified. And that is the big question of this entire section. So we will occasionally be dipping into religious questions. Consequently, this section will transition us into the next section where we will tackle one of the biggest religious questions of them all: does God exist? But for now, back to applied epistemology. I've argued that science can help us see over the fence, as it were, into Kant's noumenal world. By using abduction, we can come to justified conclusions about the way the world really is. Now, I'd say that I have a fairly accurate and reliable knowledge of the way the world is. I even know what quantum theory says about the nature of matter, and what relativity says about space-time, what astrophysics says about the universe. I understand how my body works, like about my brain, about my heart and how it pumps, and my liver, etc. The list goes on. But, truth be told, I did not acquire this knowledge directly. I haven't conducted any scientific experiments myself. I've never measured how light bends around stars, or I've never performed an autopsy to see how a heart works. I've read about scientific discoveries and the evidence for them, but I've seen very little of that evidence with my own eyes. In other words, much of my knowledge of the world comes through testimony. People tell me things are a certain way, and then I believe them. Of course, we all do this. You're doing it right now. But just how reliable is testimony? I mean, people lie all the time, right? Or they're fooled by their senses, or they're fooled by their memory. Under what conditions should I believe something if I only see it for myself? When should I believe someone else's testimony? Of course, the answer is complicated and context dependent. When can you trust testimony? Well, it depends on who's testifying and what they're testifying about and what other things that you know. But there are a few important things to remember as you consider whether or not you should believe what someone else tells you. First of all, you should care about the reliability of the testifier. If the person is a compulsive liar, well, then you should be skeptical about anything they tell you. That's just common sense. What isn't as obvious, and what can often trip people up, is adequately considering the expertise of the testifier regarding the subject they're talking about. Basic rule is this: you shouldn't believe what someone says about a topic unless they're qualified to speak on that topic. And if it's an academic subject, they need to be an expert. Now, you might think everyone knows and follows this rule. But if that were true, celebrity endorsements wouldn't be used in product advertisements. People wouldn't listen to Sally Field when she tells them Boniva promotes bone health. She's just an actress, and that's a medical matter. Another thing to remember, being an expert on one topic doesn't make you an expert on others. For example, Linus Pauling won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, was one of the most influential scientists in the 20th century. But he was completely wrong when he claimed that taking massive doses of vitamin C boosts your immune system. And people still believe this, of course. They load up on vitamin C before getting on an airplane or after they get a cold. But at least 20 well-controlled studies have been done, and they all show that megadosing vitamin C does nothing of the sort. In fact, no vitamin does. It's not that you don't need vitamins to live, you do, but megadosing them doesn't boost your immune system. If you want a healthy immune system, you simply need to eat healthy and sleep enough. How did someone as smart as Pauling get it so wrong? Well, because he was speaking outside of his field of expertise. Chemistry is not immunology. And this rule of expertise also applies to related fields. For example, a meteorologist who studies and predicts the weather is not qualified to speak on the topic of climate change. The weather is not the climate. But some issues cannot be settled by expert opinion at all. For example, ethical questions. One person saying that stealing is always wrong, while another one says stealing is sometimes justified, doesn't settle the issue either way. One must simply evaluate the arguments carefully and try not to let ideology influence that evaluation. In his book, The Will to Doubt, Bertrand Russell suggests that there are 3 common sense rules when it comes to expert testimony. 1, when the experts are agreed, the opposite opinion cannot be held to be certain. 2, when they are not agreed, when the experts are not agreed, no opinion can be regarded as certain by a non-expert. And 3, when the experts all hold that no sufficient grounds for a positive opinion exist, the ordinary man would do well to suspend his judgment. Now, these may seem obviously true, but they are so rarely followed, Russell suggests, that if we shifted to following them regularly, it would, quote, absolutely revolutionize human life. But in the same way that some issues cannot be settled by expert testimony, even expert testimony cannot unsettle some issues. Some things are so well established that even an expert telling you they are false is not a good reason to believe that they are false. So, suppose a friend of yours told you that Princess Diana was back from the dead. Now, you would likely initially conclude that they had been reading way too many tabloids. But suppose you turn on the nightly news that evening and sitting across from the anchor is a well-known certified medical doctor, the one who signed Princess Diana's death certificate, Dr. Bruno Rieu. And he's saying that Princess Diana is actually back from the dead. Princess Diana came to his office, he did a DNA test, and it's definitely her. I was certain that she was dead back in '97, he says, and I am certain that she is now not dead, that she's alive. Would you believe him? Of course not. Although he's a credible expert, and let's grant that he has no history of medical fraud, the notion that dead people stay dead is simply too well established. Even though we may not know why he is lying or mistaken, the hypothesis that he is wrong is clearly the better explanation. Let's think back to our lesson on abduction. What is the simpler, more wide-scoping, and more conservative hypothesis? The Diana rose from the dead hypothesis would only explain this one thing. But it would also raise other seemingly unanswerable questions, like, how was she raised from the dead? And invoking a supernatural agency to answer that will not only merely replace the unexplained with the inexplicable, but it will make the hypothesis less simple by introducing the existence of a new entity. What's more, such a hypothesis will not be conservative. It will contradict what we have very good reason to believe, that dead people stay dead. On the other hand, the lady dies doctor is lying or mistaken hypothesis is simple. It doesn't interject any extra entities. It's highly explanatory. In fact, it can explain many other such reports, like people who say that Elvis is still alive. And it's conservative. It coheres with the fact that dead people stay dead. Again, some things are so well established, testimony by itself cannot override them. In fact, this is likely true even for some things that you see with your own eyes. Even if Princess Diana were sitting right next to the doctor on the nightly news and you were the news anchor, it would still be more likely that she had faked her death. The doctor may have even helped her fake her death. Or perhaps she had a long-lost twin. To justifiably believe that she had actually come back from the dead, you would have to be the doctor who delivered her, so you knew that there was no twin, the doctor who declared her dead, who also had the diagnosis confirmed by other doctors independently, and also the doctor who performed the DNA test on the person claiming to be Diana today, so you know there wasn't any fakery involved. And even then, cloning might still be a better explanation. And even if you could disprove that, it would still be more rational to conclude that there's a natural, non-zombie explanation for how she's back that you simply can't detect. And we're not being stubborn here. All we're doing here is avoiding the previously discussed mystery, therefore magic fallacy. Even when we can't explain a magic trick, we're still not justified in believing in magic. In the same way, even if we can't explain how Diana is back, we are not justified in believing that she actually rose from the dead. Our knowledge that the dead stay dead is too well established. If nothing else, that we are ignorant of how she faked her death is the better explanation. But this leads to an interesting question. Could anything justify that an established rule like the dead stay dead has been broken? To answer this question, let's examine David Hume's work Of Miracles, which takes up an entire section of his An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. In it, he argues that testimony could never justify a belief that a miracle has occurred. And in a nutshell, his argument is basically this. To believe that a miracle has occurred, one would have to be justified in believing that a natural law has been violated. And to believe that a natural law has been violated, one would have to be justified in believing that a particular regularity established by experience, like dead people stay dead, had been violated. But, Hume argues, testimony will never justify such a belief. By definition, Hume argues, miracles only happen occasionally. And testimony is always indirect evidence. You didn't see it, someone else did. And you can never have as much justification for thinking something occurred as someone who saw it for themselves. However, you've experienced the regularities of nature yourself. You have seen those for yourself. And for example, all the dead people you've ever seen, they stayed dead. You have direct, repeated, inductive evidence that such laws hold. So, at best, any miracle attested to you only has indirect, someone else saw it, non-repeatable evidence. But the evidence that the laws hold, and thus that the miracle didn't occur, is direct and repeated. You've seen that for yourself. Thus, it seems testimony can never put one in an epistemic position to doubt the regularities of one's experience, and thus justify a belief that a miracle has occurred. That's Hume's argument. Now, Hume's main concern in presenting this argument was to establish that one can only take the biblical miracles on faith, that the testimony of the biblical writers is not enough epistemically to justify the belief that the miracles of the Bible actually occurred. And he was likely right about that. I mean, after all, if the testimony of a 21st century doctor with medical knowledge and expertise can't justify me in believing that Princess Diana rose from the dead, then the 2,000-year-old translated and then transcribed testimony of non-eyewitnesses living in a pre-scientific era in which knowledge about the nature of diseases was absent and in which death was commonly misidentified is definitely not going to cut it. The notion that the dead stay dead and that water doesn't spontaneously turn into wine and that blindness does not spontaneously remit upon touch, those are so firmly established that not even the testimony of 21st century experts would justify doubting these notions. But perhaps Hume's conclusion that testimony could never justify belief in the miraculous is mistaken. So let's look more closely at this argument. First of all, he defines a miracle simply as a violation of natural law. But in my experience, given how the word is most commonly used today, a miracle is simply a divine action. A miracle occurs when a supernatural force causes a specific event in the universe to occur. And that can happen without a violation of natural law. It does seem right, however, that one is not justified in believing an event is miraculous, that it's a divine intervention, unless one is justified in believing that an event violated natural law. After all, if it didn't violate natural law, then there's a natural explanation for it. And natural explanations will always be simpler and wider scoping and more conservative than their supernatural competitors. They won't invoke extra entities, they won't violate well-established scientific laws, or explain the inexplicable or explain the unexplained with the inexplicable. So, for example, even though the US 1980 Olympic hockey victory over the Soviet Union may have felt like a miracle, epistemically speaking, we are not justified in believing that it actually was a miracle on ice. It did not violate natural law. It did not require the hand of God. In fact, the notion that God causes or cares enough to interfere in sporting events to cause certain things to happen is just a bit silly to begin with. But if we are justified in believing that a miracle has occurred, only if we are justified in believing that an event has violated natural law, well then we wonder, when would we be justified in believing that a natural law has been violated? Well, Hume suggests that it's when we're justified in believing that a regularity established by our experience has been violated. If we've seen something happen over and over, we come to think that there is a natural law regarding that regularity. So, if we come to be justified in believing that that regularity was broken, then we could justifiably believe that a law has been violated and thus that a miracle has occurred. Now, the reason Hume thinks that testimony could never justify belief in the miraculous is because he thinks that it could never establish that an experience regularity has been violated. But it seems he was wrong about that. In opposition to Hume's argument, critics use a famous story called the story of the Indian prince. It's a story of a prince who had spent his entire life in India and thus had never experienced frozen water. When travelers from Northern Europe visited India, and then they told him about lakes that freeze in the winter so solid that even elephants could walk across them, he initially refused to believe them. But after enough travelers gave him independent testimony of this, he became justified in believing, contrary to his experience, that indeed water can freeze solid. So, even though this is not an example of someone coming to believe in a miracle through testimony, it does suggest that Hume was wrong. Testimony can establish that an experience regularity, like water never freezes, has been broken. The prince's experience seems to have been overruled by the testimony of the travelers. Now, in the second edition of his work, Hume responded to this objection by suggesting that since the prince never had direct experience with northern lakes during the winter, the idea that they freeze is not really contrary to the prince's experience. As Hume said, quote, "Because the prince never saw water in Muscovy during the winter, he cannot reasonably be positive what would there be the consequence." So Hume said, this is not an exception to his rule. It's not an example of testimony overruling someone's experience. But the problem, of course, is that we can make this kind of excuse for just about anything. In the same way that the prince has never directly experienced what happens to northern lakes during the winter, I have never directly experienced what happens to Welsh princesses from Norfolk named Diana after they die in a car crash. So Diana's actual resurrection wouldn't be contrary to my experience. If we limit what counts as our experience in this strict way, so that nothing that I don't experience for myself can really be said to be contrary to my experience, then almost nothing is contrary to my experience. Now, on this strict understanding, technically, Hume's thesis would still follow. Testimony only tells me about things outside of my experience. If no such thing is contrary to my experience, then no such thing could be justifiably believed to be a violation of natural law, and thus no such thing could be justifiably believed to be a miracle. So, technically, testimony still couldn't justify belief in the miraculous. Nevertheless, this line of reasoning doesn't square with the whole of Hume's argument. Initially, Hume wanted to say that we are not justified in believing in any miraculous event through testimony because testimony is not reliable enough to establish that such an event occurred. But now, on this strict understanding of experience, if someone reliable tells me that some seemingly inexplicable event happened, I can justifiably believe that it occurred. Since it's not contrary to my direct experience because it lies outside of it, I have no reason to doubt it. Now, I can't believe that such an event was miraculous since it doesn't violate my experience. I can't say it's contrary to natural law. But who cares, right? If I'm justified in believing that the event in question occurred, what does it matter if it's technically a miracle or not? Take the resurrection of Jesus, for example. Just like the prince was unfamiliar with northern lakes, I am unfamiliar with the conditions outside of Jesus' tomb on Easter morning. So strictly speaking, Jesus rising from the dead would not be contrary to my experience. Now, that means I can't consider Jesus' resurrection a miracle. It doesn't break a natural law established by my experience. But that also means that I can justifiably believe that the event occurred, that Jesus did rise from the dead. And it would seem that regardless of whether you call it a miracle, if the belief that Jesus rose from the dead is justified, then the Christian trust in Scripture is vindicated. But that can't be what Hume meant. Nothing could be more contrary to the original purpose of Hume's argument. We can also take what we've learned in this course and push our criticism of Hume even further. The prince story actually reinforces something that we already know. Our experience is not that reliable. We've already seen that our senses and memory can fool us, and how our mistakes of reasoning can cloud our judgment. The prince story just shows us another way our experience can lead us astray, by simply being limited. When the prince initially didn't believe the testimony of the travelers, he failed to account for the limits of his own experience. In reality, because our experience is fallible, we should expect things to be contrary to our experience every now and again. This is why conservatism is only one of 5 criteria regarding what determines the best explanation. Sure, all things being equal, we defer to what our experience tells us. But if some new non-conservative hypothesis turns out to be more fruitful, wider scoping, and simpler, we should admit that our experience was wrong and accept the new hypothesis. This explains how testimony can overrule our experience by establishing that some hypothesis contrary to our experience is more fruitful, wide scoping, and simple. This is what the traveler's testimony did to the prince. Siding with his experience would force the prince to conclude that the travelers had all colluded to deceive him, and that is neither a simple nor wide-scoping notion. The hypothesis that they were all telling the truth is the better explanation. And this leads to an even deeper criticism of Hume. Hume also said that we are justified in believing that a natural law has been violated when we become justified in believing that a regularity established by our experience has been broken. But this is not the case. If we expect that our experience will be occasionally contradicted because it's so fallible, then clearly when it is contradicted, we are not justified in believing that natural laws have been broken. After all, what's more likely? That the laws that govern the universe took a temporary hiatus, or that our often mistaken experience was wrong yet again? Ironically, however, by pushing our criticism of Hume this far, we end up coming full circle and realizing that Hume was actually right in the first place, just not for the reasons that he put forth. If a violation of an experience regularity is not enough to justify the conclusion that a law has been broken, then even when testimony does justify a belief that an experience regularity has been violated, it will still not justify the belief that a miracle has occurred. When testimony establishes that an experience regularity has been violated, it's not because any natural laws were broken. It's because our experience was never that reliable to begin with. We must have been wrong about what the laws were. The prince's previous experience suggested that this was a natural law. Water never becomes solid. But the testimony of the travelers didn't cause him to believe that that natural law had been broken. It caused him to believe that he was mistaken about the laws. Oh, I guess water does become solid when it gets cold enough. Notice that this is how expert testimony works. Suppose your experience makes you think that something is true. Say, that sugar makes kids hyperactive. But if you read a Yale report that explains how many double-blinded, replicated, peer-reviewed studies have demonstrated that sugar has no effect on kids' hyperactivity, you will not then believe that a miracle occurred during those experiments. Instead, you will change your view of what the laws are. You will change your view about how sugar affects kids, at least if you trust science and expert opinion, as you should. If you remember the powers and limits of your experience, you will even realize that confirmation bias and availability error are likely what led you astray. You noticed and remembered the times that kids were hyperactive after giving them sugar, and you ignored and forgot the times that they were not. In fact, even if a non-scientific expert tells you this, like I just did, and as long as they are citing actual expert testimony, like I just did, you can come to believe that an experience regularity has been violated through testimony without being justified in believing that a miracle has occurred. But what about experience regularities that are really well established? Although it's hard to articulate why, it seems that the prince's experience that water is never solid is not as established as his experience that, say, the dead stay dead. If testimony did justify the belief that someone actually did rise from the dead, well, wouldn't we be justified in believing that a natural law had been broken and thus that a miracle had occurred? After all, we wouldn't just say, oh, well, I guess I was wrong. I guess the natural laws do sometimes allow the dead to come back to life. Well, perhaps. But again, it doesn't seem that testimony ever really could justify such a belief. In the same way that our experience can lead us astray, so can a testifier's experience lead them astray. Even if they say they saw a man rise from the dead with their own eyes, they could have been mistaken about him being dead in the first place. Or maybe they confused him with someone else. Or maybe they misremembered what happened. Or they were hallucinating. Or they were deceived by a magic trick. The list goes on. That the testifier was mistaken would seem to always be the more adequate explanation. Consider Einstein's speed limit, the notion that nothing can travel faster than the speed of light, which is entailed by relativity. We think this is a natural law. What would it take to justifiably believe that it had been broken? Interestingly, in 2011, the media reported that it had been broken. What actually happened was that some measurements were made by the OPERA particle detector, the oscillation project with emulsion tracking apparatus. It suggested that the neutrinos it was measuring were traveling faster than the speed of light. The OPERA scientists actually saw these results with their own eyes. But, like good scientists, they did not jump to the conclusion that Einstein's speed limit had been broken. They started looking for ways that their experience might have led them astray, how the experiment might have gone wrong. When they couldn't find any, they still didn't jump the gun. They went to others in the scientific community and asked them to check their measurements and repeat their experiments. Only if all the relevant experts also couldn't find anything wrong with their experiment and repeated the experiment and got the same results, would we then perhaps have been justified in believing that Einstein's speed limit had been broken. Now, an error was eventually found. Simply put, a single optical wire in the giant measuring apparatus was not screwed in all the way. It was very hard to find. But my point is this: look at how hard it is to actually be justified that a law has been broken. It takes a consensus of experts drawing a conclusion after a series of well-controlled experiments. Clearly, a single person or even a group of people testifying that, oh, I saw a law violated with my own eyes, is never going to cut it. Our personal experience is just not reliable enough. What's more, notice what we would have concluded if the OPERA team's findings had been confirmed. We would not have concluded that a natural law had been violated and thus that a miracle had occurred. We would have concluded that Einstein's speed limit wasn't actually a law of nature to begin with, that we were wrong about what the laws are. Even if we did accomplish the near impossible task of showing that some law X was broken, that itself would be reason to think that law X wasn't actually a law, and thus that no miracle had occurred. So, although Hume's argument was a bit off, Hume's conclusion was right. In fact, not only can't testimony justify belief that a miracle occurred, but not even seeing such an event yourself would justify belief that a miracle occurred. It would still be more likely that your senses led you astray. And even if you could confirm your observation with well-controlled experiments successfully repeated by the scientific community, it would still be more likely that you were mistaken about what the laws were. Belief in miracles, it seems, must always just be a matter of faith. Testimony is a tricky thing, but with careful thinking, you can use it to expand your knowledge without being duped or led astray. If the testimony is about something that doesn't require a huge revision of belief, and there is no reason to think the testifier is lying, then it likely can be trusted. If the testimony is contrary to something well established by your experience, however, that's a different story. It isn't impossible for testimony to override experience, but the testimony will have to be from a source more trustworthy than your experience, most likely a relevant expert. But it could never establish that a law of nature has been broken. This may seem like common sense, but as Russell suggested, if people universally realize what expert testimony can and cannot do, the world would be completely changed. However, testimony is not the only way that we can acquire beliefs, even religious beliefs. People also rely on mystical or religious experience. Could religious or mystical experience justify belief, even belief in the miraculous? Well, that sounds like yet another big question that we should consider.